Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Philosophy is concerned with the truth. Sometimes we never get there due to the abstract nature of the concepts we study, but we still labor on joyfully. While deception has always existed at every level of human society, in modernity, we are entering an interesting and unknown territory. Deception is reaching a point where our five senses, and even our analytical thinking, have a hard time realizing when they're being fooled. Today, we're talking about deepfakes.
I appreciate the use that you let us go into this.
Yeah, so this one, we might even be jumping the gun a little bit, because when you and I were talking earlier in the week about, hey, what are we gonna talk about this week? One thing you brought up, which I thought was sort of interesting, was we've never talked about truth. We've never done an episode on truth. So at some point, we probably should, because if you think about big topics, that's certainly one. But we'll definitely address truth in this episode, but mostly in contrast or relief, as a negative image to this idea of deep fakes, which is a pretty modern term. So why don't you tell us, what is a deep fake?
A deep fake, at least as currently defined, as I understand it, is a manipulation of voice, image, or rather, a generation of voice, image, representation of a person. But it's generated entirely by AI, whereas shallow fake, or there are various terms for it, was when humans would Photoshop, use photo tools, and still do, to try to make you think something happened that didn't, or manipulate audio waves. The deep fake is all AI. And the AI, the algorithmic tools, doing what the human is asked it to do, to change a photograph or put somebody's face on somebody else's body. They call it Frankensteining, or putting a voice out that is not the person's voice, but has been accrued because of selections of the person's voice, so that the person can be made to say anything.
Yeah. So this is interesting because it's really riffing off of the conversation that you and I have had over the past several weeks about AI.
Yeah.
And there's really a direct sort of correlation with other AI processes. We've talked about how the differences between AI and regular computing, which is where, with regular computer programming, you have to set a lot of parameters. You have to code all the behaviors of a system into it. Whereas with AI, you're seeding just a couple parameters, and then the system itself is learning how to conduct tasks.
Yeah.
So if you just sort of bring that concept over into deep fakes, a shallow fake, right, would be sort of analogous to programming, where you have to use Photoshop, you have to use all of these sensitive tools, and then it's the human in control of doing all of the manipulation in order to try to fool something.
Whereas the human is able to, a well-trained human is able to say, look, here are 5 indicators that this is fake, that this boundary between the light around the speaker and the light in the background is wrong, or whatever happens to be, which is almost impossible now.
Yeah.
And we're just at the edge of this, a couple of years in. I mean, we're talking about less than 5 years, really.
Yeah. One thing that was really shocking to me is, I wouldn't say I keep up on technology or artificial intelligence, but, I think that I have a little bit of a better passing knowledge than maybe the average person. And, the last I was aware of, in order to deep fake something, you could really only do it with famous people, because you had to have enough video footage of them from enough angles, making enough facial expressions to, for the AI to gather enough information, or you had to have them say enough words that it could identify all the syllables, all the letters, all the things in order for it to generate a script. One of the things that was shocking as I was doing the preparation for the interview today was it said that there's most AI systems now can generate a deep fake with 5 seconds of video.
Yes,
now.
Very brief. And that's now. Who knows 6 months from now? I mean, we're talking in increments of months, watching the evolution of the ChatGPT was at the end of November released into being discussed with people. Now institutions are changing their policies because of it. I mean, we are at such a rapid and rapid change does not often accommodate good, reflective human thought because it's react. This is not a great thing.
Yeah. So do you know when the first deep fake was, or sort of the, when it...
Around 5 years ago, I'm trying to remember I've read of this, what the initial one was. It wasn't, among the first ones was an attempt to have Donald Trump say, I mean, how the things he said anyway, why would you? To have him say something that would provoke Ukraine or something like this, and they could look at still managed at that point to look at the lips. The lips weren't quite in sync.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think from what I was reading, the first deep fake was actually of Obama. They were trying to get him to. They were trying to use a different line of dialogue from what he was actually saying, and see if they could match up his lips to the new dialogue. Before that, this wouldn't count as a deep fake, but I think that it's sort of like the historical origin of this idea. Was in 1997 with the video rewrite program, that was probably the first shallow.
That fake. Was the shallow one, yeah. And it doesn't need to be explored in our conversation necessarily, but the interesting thing is it's Obama or Trump, or we're talking about Ukraine, world leadership kinds of issues, world politic level things, but also pornography and the ethical issues that all of that brings up, a whole separate discussion of who owns one's image, endless possible topics with it. But the fact that we go toward the world changing level or the culture changing level almost immediately. And apologists of all kinds say, well, yeah, but this was just a game. This is just to get people to tweet people. And my first reaction to it is, no, this is not a game. It's far too, the implications are far too resonant for it just to be a game. But there are also possible virtuous, to riff off of your conversation with Iggy, or ethical uses for it.
Yeah, and we'll get into those in a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is interesting. I mean, when you look at sort of the history of these things, a lot of this technology originated in academic institutions, right? And it makes you wonder. I don't really know what the motivation was for the development of the technology initially. But going back further than that, is there any historical precedence for this type of deception? If we go back farther in history, have there been cases historically where people have tried to substitute other people in order to deceive people?
Yes, wartime back to, let's say, when photography was in its development. I mean, there are situations or cases of these things happening in the Civil War. To try to mislead somebody that somebody was in a different location than they might be. But we're talking about daguerreotype. This is not, the word primitive doesn't work anymore. It's not a nice word, but it's certainly nascent. In the World War II, all kinds of trying to mislead people about where people were with evidentiary material. But when we get, so I think it's associated with war or major manipulation for political purpose.
Yeah, which is funny because, I mean, if you think about it, it's still being used in the same way. You know, it's manipulation of political leadership at the highest level. It's sort of been this. And when I think about it, I think all the way back to ancient Rome. I was watching a documentary where they said, you know, in Rome, they'd build these beautiful marble statues of the emperor, but they'd always build them with the head as a separate piece from the body. And so once the Republic turned into an empire, not a lot of people know this, but I mean, the average length of an emperor's reign was like less than 2 years or something. Mm-hmm. So these guys were constantly getting stabbed in the back, you know, murdered, people taken over for them. And so what they do is they just go around the city and pull these heads off and then drop the new head of the new emperor on. If you think about it, I mean, that's a deep fake in a physical form. Right?
It is. It's an attempt to change historical memory, and it is Frankensteining way before Frankenstein was ever a concept.
Yeah, because they said that, you know, it's very rare to find statues of a lot of these emperors because full statues that didn't have the detachable head were so rare. Because, you know, first off, most of them had that detachable head, so you just put a different head on the body. But the ones that were whole, normally the new emperor would order them destroyed, you know. So lots of times there's these emperors, you know, somebody who, I mean, if you think about it, the highest political leader of the largest country in the world, and the physical evidence of his reign is almost non-existent because of this human urge to rewrite history or sort of lead people astray in order to not, you know, for their own.
The importance, or if not to erase the importance. Yeah, there's a really interesting. You probably read it. Dailyphilosophy.com is a wonderful site, and you get all kinds of things of it. But there was one that partly got me to thinking about all this. It's called Deepfakes, Deception, and Distrust, Epistemic and Social Concerns. David Villena is the writer. And some of the things he's talking about that we can get to when it seems appropriate, but where is the idea of different kinds of evidence that we have in the past, up till the very recent past, these situations with wartime and the Romans notwithstanding, we generally have trained ourselves to trust testimonial evidence, which is to say the written word, which is to say I was there, I saw this, a journalistic writing. But we seem to be have been tipping towards, since the development of the various video technologies, toward perceptual evidence. And the article was pointing out that using a case of Prince William and statements that Prince William is said to have made regarding the Ukraine, this is an alien thing to the European continent. We expect it with Middle Eastern and African cultures. Well, if indeed that was said, it was a horrific thing to have been said. But it was reported. And then video emerged, a very rough video without seeing Prince William's head. It was a shaky kind of video in which he said no such thing. And so then there were a number of retractions and apologies because the perceptual evidence overcame the testimonial evidence. And this is something this is new in a very real sense. It brings Plato to mind, who we've said before. He was warning everybody about what writing would do, the evils writing would do to human memory and so on and so forth, even though Plato wrote. Well, but now we're at that place where, we're not going to trust writing. We're going to trust what we see. At the same moment that what we see is more subject to manipulation than ever.
Yeah. And that's what I was alluding to in the intro, is that we're really reaching a very interesting point in human history, because there's definitely a distrust of the written word, or journalistic reporting, but this reliance on our five senses, our ability to see something or to hear something, right? It's being able to be replicated. A deception is able to be replicated at an increase, an exponentially convincing rate. Like one of the questions I had for this show that ended up polling was, how are deepfakes made? After I stumbled across that article that I just talked about earlier, right? Mm-hmm. Because I was going to talk about how, again, scientists and researchers will feed images of somebody from different angles, and their voice, speaking different scripts and stuff, doing that sort of thing, and then after that, the computer, the AI system will watch hours of video of the person, and then they can make a deepfake. It's not the case anymore. As a matter of fact, when I was helping a different guy set up a podcast recently, I was searching some of the new options, and one of the places allowed just anybody to do voice cloning. So for a small fee, you read, I want to say it was a 60-sentence script.
Okay.
And then what the podcast distributor would do for you is they would run ads on your podcast with you speaking a script that an advertiser wrote, but you didn't actually have to say it. The advertiser would just use your voice, right? And they said, this is an excellent tool. You can use it for producing audiobooks, right? If you've written a book, then after you write it, rather than having to
hire somebody to do voice work, I know some people.
Right. Or rather than having to read it yourself, you just read your 60 sentences and then plug it into the voice cloner, and it will read the whole book for you in your voice, right? And this technology is available to anybody who pays a small fee, right? So honestly, we've reached the point where I don't understand how deepfakes are made anymore, right? I don't understand the process for, in as little as 5 seconds being able to, how the system is able to infer how somebody would look or speak or act in a multitude of different scenarios. So the technology is increasing at an exponential rate, right? So yeah, how do we trust what we perceive? And this has always been a philosophical question.
This has always been
going back to Descartes.
This is epistemic perception.
Yeah,
we're talking about, and going back to Descartes and even further, trusting your senses. The epistemic perception issue. We want to be able to say, I trust what I see. Well, we go to movies and we know certain things aren't happening, and there's still the uncanny valley in some movies with the effects. Nonetheless, we suspend our disbelief. But we're not talking about entertainment. We're talking, and as you just said, as I read each week about these exponentially developments in AI, I had never heard of generative adversarial networks. And generative adversarial networks are AI algorithmic trained systems to find the flaws in deepfake. But the writer describes this as a cat and mouse game that's going on between two systems. But eventually the point is that the one system will be able to finally learning from the generative adversarial network so that it can't even be discerned by other AI.
Mm.
And we're already at the place where that's visible on the very near horizon.
It's funny to me that that's it's like analogous to antibiotics almost, right?
Yeah.
Like you use this thing to fight an infection, but then the infection eventually learns how to evade it, and then you reach this point where the medicine, it's almost as if the medicine became the sickness in some way, or enabled the sickness in some way.
Yeah. So what do we do? I mean, for me, I have to say that my one of my concerns, and maybe I'm jumping the gun on the questions about this, now that we're laying the groundwork for it, is what does it mean for planetary communication? What does it mean for? And of course, I shouldn't say of course, but the first thing that comes to mind is that people will be deceived, and deceiving people and experiencing deception is the worst thing. But I've come to realize, reading the articles that I've been reading the past couple of weeks, no, probably not. Probably the worst thing is that it's the distrust that is engendered. What's worse than being fooled? Having a rootedness of cynicism and a rootedness of, okay, I can't trust anything that I see. So then they can stop fooling you at that point, because we're back to Orwell.
Yeah.
How many fingers am I holding up? And if you don't say 6, or you don't say 4, or even if 5 fingers are being held up, then you're going to get punished.
Yeah. No, and we talked about this. I think it was our last episode. I think we talked briefly about consciousness, right? And how your sensory perception isn't wholly, but it's distinct from your conscious perception. So your senses receive information, and then up to 15 seconds later, the scientists are finding, your consciousness integrates all the information and comes to a conclusion about something. So, and with that in mind, this idea of trusting your senses, in a way, we already don't, because the sensory information doesn't lie to us, right? What we see, what we hear, what we smell, taste, touch, all of those things are objective to the extent that we are capable of perceiving them, right? We talk about all the time. Okay, we only see a sliver of the light spectrum, or hear a little bit of the audio spectrum, but we hear what is happening in the world. But then what our consciousness, what all of the organic wiring in our brain does with those signals, and then what our prefrontal cortex tells us is going on, that is almost completely separate from the sensory experience itself, right? Because there are many cases where people see something or hear something, and I mean, you can think about any aspect of life, whether you want to talk about somebody with deep political affiliations seeing something that's obviously wrong, or even a magician doing a trick or something like that, right? Whatever it is, the sensory information conflicts with, what the cognitive output, how your brain takes all that sensory information and what it decides to do with it, doesn't necessarily correlate with the sensory information itself. So there's already this idea of, you don't necessarily even have to be a deeply cynical person to distrust your senses. And many of us, due to our internal biases and things, are already distrusting our sensory information without even knowing or thinking that we're
without
doing
any
so.
assistive technology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, are there any positive aspects to deepfakes?
I have read of some, and I've been reflecting on this. Some articles of what I mentioned before have pointed out things such as, if one has lost one's voice, and is trying to say something. Perhaps in more extreme circumstances, people with aphasia who can't put words together. If there is a library of your voice that is able to, maybe you can press some buttons and your voice can tell somebody something that you aren't capable of telling them. That's a possible use. A possible use would be able, as you were just talking about, with reading circumstances, or we were talking with your wife Amanda about this, where if someone is not confident, and maybe if something was being read to them in a voice that they trust or find soothing or inspirational, that they might be moved to read more or act more. There are all kinds of tutorial kinds of things, which is what I said about ChatGPT too. I think there are possibilities, educative possibilities. There are the one that was mentioned that I'm not necessarily on board with entirely. I'm still thinking about it. Is that you could take someone who has died and put fresh words into, make them animated in ways that you didn't see them, so this historical figure becomes alive. Well, I've seen some examples of this just with people who have passed on, but you have a still shot and then you can make them sing.
Mm.
And I find that really, really troubling.
I do too. I don't like it.
You know, I've seen it, and part of that's the uncanny valley, but part of it is, no, my mom didn't sing this way. I don't want to get a card where she's singing to me. That's not part of the experience. No, nonetheless, you know, just offhand, I think that there are possible educative uses for this, but I don't think they outweigh the caution that we have to have.
Yeah. You know, I think that obviously any technology, you know, it's not a ethically good or bad thing. It's a tool, and so it depends on how it's used by people.
Yeah.
I think that just the deepfake technology, at least at this point, is very much more destructive and harmful than it is positive. That being said, there are positive aspects to it. Another one that I found was protecting people's identities. I think they were shooting a war documentary or a documentary about opposing political tyranny. In order to protect the identities of the people, they deepfaked their faces. They gave them different faces, right? So they couldn't be identified. Okay, well that might be a pretty good use. There's probably other ways of doing that would be just as effective.
I think that it's, and yes, those are, I think cautionary tales are deeply important. Deepfake, deeply important. Deep. But I find it just enormously telling that the studies of this so far have shown that about 95, 96% of deepfake technology is used for pornographic purposes. So here we are, a planet full of people. We have this kind of technology. We have 5% of those who manipulate it wanting to either have fun or to do political manipulation. And the rest are engaging in a frivolity that may not be considered a frivolity, whatever one wants to call it, that has nothing to do with human development.
Yeah.
Right. We're typical out of the trees, out of the caves. Oh, let's.
Yeah. And that's why I was sort of interested, because I mean, that statistic is shocking, right?
It is.
And so to think that, like I was saying at the beginning, this technology developed in universities. So what was the intended use of it to begin with, right? I mean, I find it hard to believe that, you know, you could get a research grant for that sort of thing. I think that, you know, but is it likely that maybe the government was behind the scenes trying to develop it? You know, what was the purpose of it to begin with? You know,
I don't find it necessarily nefarious purpose. I'm back to that little side note for discussion that I was having last night, again, about the science fiction anthology. And there was a couple of stories about technology, one of which you could choose a memory to erase, and would you do it? And and things tangentially related to this. Research is research. You do research to see, well, what can we do? What, when Adobe, what is the thing it developed? Voco, I think, is the program to do vocal shopping the way video or image. And then security services are approaching them and saying, there are we need to think about this. I don't think that initially, necessarily, people are saying, oh, what nefarious purposes can we put this to? Just, what can we do?
Yeah.
That's what humans do. What can I do with these 2 stones? Let's see. What can I do with this algorithm? How we end up using it is sociologically very revealing, but I don't think that's necessarily, I don't think there's necessarily a point.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that you're right. I think that a lot of basic research is done, like you said, to figure out what you can do with tools rather than ever actually seeing what the end result of them are. And I think history reflects that. I also think about our conversation we had last week talking about science fiction and how, how technology is influenced by science fiction, but it's not predictive of it. And, I think that the uses of deepfake technology, like you said, primarily for pornography and for political manipulation, rather than 1984 or A Brave New World predicting the future, you see elements of both of them developing through the technology, right? And the 2 books, although talking about dystopian futures, are really very different versions of dystopian futures.
Yeah.
And it looks very much like our future, rather than explicitly following one or the other path, is very likely to be some amalgamation of it, right? Because, I think that sometimes science fiction they take those things to the extremes because that's what makes a good story. But I think human nature is to make the widest use of something. Any what we found with technology and tools, right, is if you can make a use of it, you will. You will. And so it spans the spectrum of capabilities.
Yeah.
And do you think we've covered all of the ethical issues with deepfakes? What are some of the? So we have fraud, we have authenticity concerns.
And we have just the deceptions that could be used for any. Yeah, I think when you say fraud, then we could fit thievery, crimes of all kinds underneath that. Political manipulation. And then there's a whole separate discussion we can have sometime about whether manipulation can be ideologically or ethically supported or not. But but this can lead to that because there's the manipulative, there's the deceptive, there's the criminality possibilities, there's the educative possibilities. So I think in broad strokes, probably we've.
Yeah, I think, and we talked about this with Chat GPT a couple weeks ago. The security concerns, right? Hey, this thing can write code that can hack stuff, that can create viruses, can do these things. I was reading an article right before we started about DALL-E and how artists are saying, hey, I never gave anybody permission to feed this thing my artwork, to make this, to put this in its algorithm. That's an interesting part of this, right? Because I think that with deepfakes, it's very obvious, right? If you are a celebrity, you obviously don't want your face photoshopped onto a pornographic actor's body. And it seems pretty obvious that there's a consent thing involved there, right? Hey, that's my image. I don't want you putting that there. With DALL-E or with Chat GPT, right? That's a little bit more subtle because we don't think of the artists, the painters, or the writers of these books or these things. We don't think of them as necessarily needing to give consent for these programs to go in and consume all of their knowledge and then spit it out.
No,
do you think that they do need it?
Well, I think that
because here's the interesting part, right? When we talk about AI being creative, we said they're essentially doing what people do, right? Yes. And I mentioned it when we were talking about it last. I said, yeah, I'll hear a cool part of a song and I'll ask ChatGPT what happened and it will tell me.
Yeah.
And then later on, I'll use that same technique in one of my songs. I'm not copying it exactly. It's not in any way and definitely based on historical court cases, I could in no way be prosecuted as plagiarizing somebody else's work.
Right.
The fact of the matter is, you have a very limited number of notes in a scale, in chords, and sorts of things. So your combinations and how you melodically over harmonic structure can create things, it's very limited.
Yes.
But and with painting, right? Oh, okay, well, everybody paints landscapes, so who's to say, that if 60,000 people paint the same winter landscape, that there aren't going to be some that very closely resemble other ones. Well, did the artist who painted this painting look at 12 other artists' paintings of winter landscapes and then paint his own? Most likely, yes.
That's
right.
What one allows oneself, seeks to be influenced by others.
Yeah. So what's the differentiation between a human doing this, taking, observing various art or various literature or whatever, and then amalgamating or creating something new out of it, and AI doing it?
Okay, 2 or 3 thoughts. First, I think that we have to acknowledge that probably we foolishly, in the collective sense, how many of us have clicked the button that said, this app has access to your videos and photos?
Yeah.
I more consciously now don't, and often that I can't use a certain app that does that, but I've done it because I want to get to using the app or whatever it is. And so, in some sense, we have inadvertently given access to things that we wouldn't have thought were actually going to be used. Not universally, but I think that has to be acknowledged. Because from a legal point of view, some of us have probably done that without thinking, which doesn't justify our decisions, but it happens. I think that it's possible, as I said before, if AI becomes defined as an alternate life form, and it generates what it is calling art, that we can acknowledge that it is art from an AI viewpoint, and also say, but it's not art in a human sense. I think we're trying to apply the same cloak or the same umbrella to both things. We find that whales sing. We're learning more and more about what those actually may be stories that are being told. A whale story, whatever it is unlikely to be a human story. And so you can have, let's say we extrapolate ahead to a fairly new, not far away future where they're whale stories. Are they equally human stories? Why is that relevant? We don't need to do this. We've done too much harm doing this imperialistic, I'm better than you, and stuff. It's an alternate form. DALL-E would be an alternate form if it were the AI choosing to do art. But when it's a human telling the AI, well, go out and do this, the human skill, the development of skill, the development of craft, the thought that one might be putting into it, I think is arguably not present, and therefore it doesn't equate to human art. So what am I essentially saying? Sweat and blood? Well, sort of, but more that from intention. And I don't think that one can argue yet that AI of its own decided to create art.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And, I think that sort of the point of what you're saying goes back to the discussion I just had with Iggy Perillo talking about, we have this Cartesian split reductionist view of reality, right? Where we would like to say we want to sort of reduce things down and be able to say this or that, right? So, and it doesn't really work that way, right? AI creates art, people create art, and there's different processes that go in, but the output is this pictorial thing or this line of dialogue or something.
Yeah.
And I think that how it's generated is important. But I think that that's a real can of worms in trying to say, you know, is that part of it is difficult. The part of it I'd like to focus on is, do you think that the people who have developed these AI have infringed on the right of artists or writers or other people in using their paintings or their books in order to generate this AI's knowledge base?
I don't think it's infringing if it's material that is in the public domain, or if it's material that any human could read or go to a museum and see. I think it's infringing when if and when it is plucked from people's personal files or caches of images or whatever it might be, because those weren't intended for a wide viewing. That for me is really the line, and I know it's a very small, seemingly small line, but yeah, we all, well, most know what the Mona Lisa is, if never having seen the original, have seen endless. How many advertisers have used the Mona Lisa in various ways, cartoons and otherwise? So if we suddenly say, yeah, but when AI does it, it's wrong, I think that's a non-starter for me.
Yeah, it's a sticky subject, right? Because going back to, the easiest case as an example is like celebrity pornography, right? The celebrities who are having this done to them, it's not the same as what happened a few years ago where they had nude photos leaked from their iCloud accounts, right? It's not like a hacker went in and stole something that was secret. What happened is in the deepfake cases, they're just public figures. So their faces are all over movies, right? So you can just take their faces from movies, which are public things, and then put them in a compromising position that they were never intended for. Yeah. This could happen to you and I, right? There could be somebody that listens to our podcast, clones our voices, and then makes us spew Nazi propaganda or something, right? That's totally possible. So, and our podcast is free, open to the public, that sort of thing. So, those things are public, but they're not intended for the purposes that the AI deepfakes are using. How do we address those?
Because we don't. Well, an extremist view, we could all shut down. We could stop talking in public. Well, that would be a fast track to fascism. That would be just not productive in any sense that I can think of. But we also have this human hope that is not entirely unsupported, that most of us aren't going to be doing this, statistically at least, and that there are always going to be bad actors who will misuse whatever technology is available. We've certainly seen that all the way up to the nuclear level. So I don't, it is a can of worms, and I don't think that the first always knee-jerk human reaction of, we'll just shut it down, turn it off, is going to happen, because once we've made something, we've made it. It never goes away. So I think the not just being aware of it, but trying to make the decisions about what one is saying and whether one is still continuing to want to be speaking in public, or to want to draw, to want to create, and will do so despite those possibilities. It's not ignoring it. It's just saying, well, on balance, yeah, I totally realize that this could happen. I also would like to believe that for many people, there would be a discernment made, but there might not be. There was a pretty vile thing. Well, Lyndon Baines Johnson said many vile things, but one of the things that he was good at was misdirecting people into trying to call into question whether somebody had done something by making just the vaguest suggestion. And he had an advisor. His advisor say, "Well, you can't say that in public." Well, I'm not saying it in public. I'm just saying, but what if he did? That the person did this, and then the other person gets eventually put into the position of illocutionary. What's the term? Illocutionary. I've forgotten the term, but it's illocutionary something, and it essentially means being forced to say something you didn't intend to say, and having to defend yourself that you never said it, and that can sidetrack entire lives. That can do enormous damage to individuals. It certainly can do political damage, and it was used long before deepfakes were a thing.
Yeah, it reminds me of sort of the solipsism's distortion of Socratic questioning, right? There's a difference between probing for something, and then there's a difference between sort of starting out with a goal in mind and not caring if it's true, but using discourse argument to try to prove a point that doesn't exist. Do you think that this technology will facilitate a pendulum swing back towards trusting some journalistic sources? For instance, like I just talked about, I'm really nervous that I use the words Nazi on the podcast now, and in the context of somebody stealing our voices, right? Well, there's a term that they have me saying, so they can use it, right?
Oh, dear.
So, but let's continue with the example, because we're already in trouble.
Indiana Jones says Nazis. I hate those guys.
Yeah, so we're already in trouble if
right.
somebody decides to do it, right? So let's say somebody decides to use our voices to say something that we would never say.
Yeah.
Do you think that at some point in the future, people will say, you know what? Okay, there's an initial shock, but then they'd say, well, if we go back and listen to the podcast, that seems antithetical to anything they believe. Or maybe even there's an AI tool that's developed that listens to all of our podcasts instantaneously and then provides like a percentage score of how likely it is that we said the thing that we said. Do you think that there will be some sort of pendulum swing in the future that will mitigate some of these instances of deepfakes?
So take us back to testimonial evidence.
Yeah. Rather than
perceptual evidence. Oh gosh, Joel, I'd like to think so, but looking at where the newspapers that continue to evaporate and be subsumed by larger corporate entities, and the journalistic tendencies, and the reduction of the writerly workforce, I don't see that happening anytime soon. I think that once we're into the catastrophic mode of the undeniable catastrophic mode of climate change, which is already presenting itself in so many ways. I think that no matter what anybody says, when the temperatures are what they've never been before, and all the other deadly things are happening, that eventually, even then, perceptual evidence is going to outweigh. The people won't go back and say, oh, well, people have been trying to tell us this for decades. They won't pay attention to that. They'll pay attention to, it's happening right now, and I don't have enough water. So I'm not optimistic about that, but I don't think journalism is going away. I think enough of us still need it and trust it that it will continue. I'm not sure if it will return full force.
Yeah, and I mean, even if it does, the market for it is as low as it is, and they've come out with I forget what news outlet it was, but one of them was found to be using AI to write articles, using ChatGPT actually to write its articles, and it's known that ChatGPT is not always accurate.
Of course not, because it's programmed, as we've talked about before, because it's programmed by human beings. It's algorithmically.
The information that it's consuming, it could be consuming information that is false, and then sort of regurgitating that or synthesizing it with other information.
Or enhancing it, and yeah.
I was reading an article right before the show, actually. It was talking about how if you ask ChatGPT ethical questions, it will give you unethical answers. And I said it's not a virtuous program. I go, hey, virtue.
Virtue.
I said that's a word I haven't heard in the public discourse in a long time, and that we just talked about.
Mm-hmm.
So the issues are all there. It's really has reached almost a critical mass in some ways. I think we're not very far from it.
I agree. We aren't, and we're having to deal with it. I just think that the knee-jerk human reaction, as we're seeing it, and having been in the college system for so long, there are educative possibilities for all of this. There are ways of taking a deep fake and showing people what it was generated from, perhaps, or to say, well, clearly we're misleading ourselves if we think we can even discern. So if we're past the point of being able to discern epistemically, the epistemic perceptual is denied by the technology, then we are left with logic, reputation, as Shakespeare would talk about, concatenated experience of an individual or group, or as you say, going back through at rapid pace, pulling together everything that somebody has said. Is this likely? Well, we're essentially being put in the role of having to be detectives, and I love a good detective fiction, right? But to be more careful than ever about why we think why do we want to believe that piece that is being presented visually? Is it because it justifies a belief? And this is the epistemic again. Does it justify belief? Does it run counter to belief and challenge belief? And challenge is good if it comes from the proper motivations and a virtuous anchor. So it's here. We are having to deal with it, but to just wholeheartedly, the first thing you do is build up walls, put in a syllabi and say, there are even more punishments now for you. We're redefining what the word plagiarism means in the case of ChatGPT. I understand that response, but that's not going to lead to any dialogue of worth. It's not going to lead to, but what's happening with students and how might this be useful to students, and how do we need to adjust as teachers to first say, no, you shouldn't be writing your essays and turning them in and saying that the AI's work is yours. But I think a lot of people know that anyway. So why is it being done? What are the situations that are causing it to be done?
Yeah. No, absolutely. There's no putting the genie back in the bottle, so we better be very careful with our wishes, right? So until next time, keep